Felix remained an extra day in intensive medical because his nervous system had developed immunity to the standard formula Propoderm. An alternative was found and administered, allowing time for the rebuilt musculature of his left thigh to set. When he suggested to a confused Meditech that his several past exposures to the vitro may have caused the immunity, she merely laughed. "You have any idea how many exposures that would take, soldier? At least 8, maybe 10. She laughed, patted him on a cheek, and bounced jauntily away, missing his reply that it had taken, in fact, 12. There were no troubles with his broken bones. There never were. He rode to debriefing in the Barrow, newly installed aboard the Terra. It was his first trip down the tubes. He hated it. It was not that he didn't appreciate the idea behind it. It did cut down the traffic of stretchers in the corridors. But when they strapped him into his conveyor pod, it reminded him of the worst of the nightmares about the suit. The Meditech awaiting him at Intelligence Station had been feuding with the Steno before he got there. Felix provided more fuel.
"This is just what I've been saying, damn it!"
said the Meditech, his hands jammed angrily onto his hips.
"This man should have been given a lot more rest before having to submit to your... whatever it is you do that you think is so damned important that you can't even take the time to... Nigal? Please!"
The Steno replied, arching her eyebrows in Felix's direction.
"Can't we finish this at some other time?" "Oh, sure,"
snapped the Meditech disgustedly, shoving the stretcher against her with a slap of his palm.
"Excuse me for living,"
he added, and stomped away. Felix, still strapped in, could only refuse to excuse him for now. The Steno was apologetic, profusely, offhandedly. Then she became businesslike, running through the sole survivor questionnaire like a pro. Felix's replies were equally businesslike. He was something of an expert at this particular routine. Noting the time it had taken to get through it, the Steno smiled at Felix and said, "You're pretty good at this." She patted Felix on the shoulder and added jokingly, "You must have done this before."
"Twice before,"
Felix replied, a response that would have astonished the Steno had she heard it. But then came the angry return of the Meditech, complaining that he simply could not, in the best interests of the patient, allow this grilling to continue. The Meditech plucked the cigarette out of Felix's mouth and refastened the straps. Then he wheeled the stretcher to the access plate and stood there, grumbling to himself.
"Nigal?"
came whispered at them from just around the bulkhead.
"If you could just give me a second to explain."
It took an hour. Felix stayed strapped, out of earshot, out of mind, out of giving a damn where he was. He slept, awaking in the Barrow. When Felix told them he wasn't dropping again, they sent for a fresh-faced, rather handsome young psychotech who managed to destroy his own credibility with a single, breathtaking observation.
"Whew! I had no idea these starships were so big. I damn near got lost getting here."
Next, he plopped down next to Felix's bed, patted him on his recently dislocated shoulder, and produced a cigarette.
"Mind if I have one?"
he asked. Felix not only didn't mind, he offered to install it. The psychotech's glamorous features registered his startled surprise for only an instant before sliding quickly and easily, like slime, into the humor-him smile reserved for only the maddest hatters. His first series of questions fitted well with the smile. Felix, stone-faced and trembling, refused at first to answer, but he eventually relented. He found the man incredibly patronizing, even for an idiot, but the veteran's need for easy, trivial conversation welled up in him strongly, clinically. The psychotech left after half an hour, assuring Felix he would return the next day. On his way out of the ward, he managed to catch the eye of the Meditech and request Felix's records. The Meditech seemed astonished that the shrink hadn't had them all along. The psychotech clapped her on the shoulder and said that he never looked at the records first.
I look at the man, he added. He is an individual, not simply a number.
Felix couldn't stop laughing for several minutes. Later that night, he awoke and laughed some more. 3 days later, the psychotech returned to tell Felix, it is Felix, isn't it, that he had given his case a great deal of thought and had decided to have him transferred to a soft duty for the time being. Soft Banshee duty.
Like falling off a horse, you know? Gotta get right back on.
That night, Felix was told to return to his squad bay. He was told that the change meant nothing other than a shortage of beds for non-restrained psychs. Felix accepted the lie for what it was. The next morning, his screen beeped him awake from the foot of his bed to inform him that he had been transferred to auxiliary duty as part of a squad due to drop the next day with Admiralty's staff. He was further informed that failure to report would result in charges being preferred against him for dereliction of something or other. Felix slept the rest of that day and most of the next night. He awoke only once. He lay in his bed, staring at the overhead and smoking for almost 2 hours. He spoke once, just before rolling over and going back to sleep.
And do what?
He said to the shadows on all sides. The psychotech was just outside the lockers to wish him off. He brandished a coil before Felix's face. Felix recognized his service ID number on the casing.
I'm going back right now and go over every word of this. We'll talk when you get back.
He leaned forward next, almost whispering.
Don't worry, Felix. A lot of people doubt themselves in the beginning. It's only natural.
Felix tried not to hate him, as he tried not to hate individual ants. But, as with the ants, he failed. In the drop bay, surrounded by aides, staff, and, to his astonishment, members of the press corps, Felix met Nathan Kent. It was to be his first drop. Kent asked Felix if he had dropped before. Felix said that he had. It was morning on Banshee. The sun sat low on the horizon, shimmering sickly green through the foul atmosphere, making long shadows and heat for the ant coming up the dune to kill him. Felix stood alone atop the dune, a bluntly jagged mass of coarse encrusting sand, and regarded the lumbering monster. It was clumsy, even for an ant. Clumsy and slow and ridiculous. It was, of course, the cold. He turned and glanced toward the hated sun. It would be ant weather in a very short while, less than an hour, perhaps. He returned his attention to the ant, slogging determinedly. His examination was born of an oddly surreal detachment, macabrely imbued with great attention to detail, such as how far away, at that instant, was the ant from being close enough to kill him. He figured 30 meters. Now 29, 28. How fast was it coming to kill him? Not very. The cold still. 25. How soon would it be there to kill him? Soon. A minute, maybe. Still 25 meters, he noted, as the ant stumbled against the slope. How much difference was that morning sunshine making? An interesting question there, Felix decided. The staggering, sluggish ghoul it was now could only kill him slowly. The skittering, lunging ghoul it would become, on the other hand, could kill him less slowly. He figured the ant would still be cold and slow by the time it arrived. There were only 20 or so meters left. And how, while he was at it, would the ant go about killing him? Another interesting question. Fascinating. Would it, for example, simply stomp to the crest of the dune and hammer him to death by, say, bashing his faceplate into his forehead? Probably, Felix thought, at 18 meters. Or maybe it would just reach up and clamp onto his knees and drag him down where it could crush him to death by wedging the razor-sharp edges of its pincers into the seams of his suit. Might do that. Might do both. Hammer now and tongs later. 10 meters. The ant had reached the last and steepest section and begun to heave ponderously up the pockmarked slope. It tripped. Both globular eyes rolled upward, the spinal shaft arched stiffly, the great skull head tilted forward, and it fell. It fell straight back in slow motion like a huge tree. It slammed back first with a dull thud, sending a great sheet of sand splashing into the air. As it hit, the ant began twirling its claws for balance. Felix shook his head. "Dumb jerk," he muttered. "Now you've got 25 meters to go again." He smiled. For some reason, caught himself at it, stopped it. He sighed deeply. He knew what was wrong. He didn't believe. Still, after 6 months and 20 drops, after uncounted injuries and countless horrors, after all the killing of the ants before him and the people around him, after all the pain, all the terror, still, he could not fully believe it. He looked away from the ant and scanned the horizon. Endless dunes. Some were smooth, but most were stiffly crusted, with jagged edges and harsh crumbling bluffs, victims and creations of the searing erosive winds that could pack and jam even the largest of them together in a single day, before blasting them flat in the span of another. Felix never recognized any place on Banshee, however often he might be dropped in a given area. There were always new dunes, new ridges, new mesas to be found. Even the damned sand could change. The geotechs had cataloged something like 2,000 different grain patterns, and with the different colors and textures and formations of each, nothing ever seemed truly familiar. So he never knew what footing to expect. Once, fleeing wildly and alone, he had leapt atop one firm ridge and sunk out of sight into the next. It had taken him a long time to dig his way out. They had almost had him that time. Another time, fleeing again, alone again, he had come upon a wall of sand as smooth and strong as plastiform. His powered, armored fingers had only just barely managed to carve the toeholds he needed to scale it. They had almost had him that time, too. A kilometer to the west was a sea, glowing a rich, innocent blue between two towering ridges. The beauty of it offended him, for it held no water as man knew it. It wouldn't even freeze. Too much acid. Even the ants avoided it, the reason for dropping here. Felix glanced down to see the ant managing, at last, to stand erect once more. It began, without hesitation, to clamber toward him once again. He watched it take a few lumbering steps. He couldn't be sure. It might be only his imagination. But it seemed more agile than before. The sun had barely moved. It couldn't be warm enough yet. Still, it could happen very quickly, and there was never any warning. More than once he had been surprised by sleepwalking ants, which began needing 30 seconds to take as many steps, but were suddenly, 2 seconds later, 10 steps closer, and on him, and raking at his faceplate. But this one, he decided after a moment, wasn't ready for that yet. Not quite done. What he ought to do, he knew, was change dunes. Pick one with a shaded approach that would keep the ant cool while it climbed. The ant wouldn't notice, or care. It would simply come at him, directly at him, through sun or shadows or blazer fire. So Felix should move. But he didn't. He just stood there, where he was, and watched the ant. It was this sight, this creature, that he found hardest to believe. So damn big, half again as tall as a suited man, and incredibly strong, incredibly resolute, incredibly hard to kill. And it must be killed. There was no other way to stop it. It didn't care about fear. It didn't care about pain. It didn't care about death. It didn't care about anything but killing people. But you really care about that, don't you? Felix thought. You love that. Below him, the ant tripped again, this time on its own footpad. It fell forward against the slope, driving its claws into the sand, almost to the shoulder joints. It struggled a bit, trying to pull itself out, but only shoved the mandibles deeper. For a moment, it paused, staring at the holes it had made. It didn't seem to know what to do. Then it began to rock violently back and forth. Felix snorted disgustedly. It was about the worst thing it could have tried. But it'll work anyway, won't it, Ant? He asked. Because you're so fucking strong. Felix smiled bitterly, without pleasure. Too dumb to get out of the shade, but oh so strong, and so eager to get me somehow. Anyhow, that was another thing about them. Ants didn't care what it took to kill people, bashing them to death, burning them with blasters, peeling them piece by frozen piece from their armor. They didn't care how. Ants would kill other ants to kill people. They would kill themselves to do it. And they didn't care how long it took either. This ant would climb this slope as long as Felix stood atop it. It would climb and slide down, and climb and fall down, and climb and on, trying through this day and the next and the next. Until it had climbed the dune, or had dragged it down around it grain by grain, or starved to death trying. A robot. Less than a robot. Much less. Mindless. A wind-up toy. And yet, ants had tools. Elaborate, sophisticated tools. They made them, knew how to use them. And they had their hives, and they had their blasters, and... Hell! Felix cried aloud. You've got space travel! Star travel, in fact! You attacked Earth! He stared at it, shaking his head. Damn you, anyway! He groaned, impulsively kicking the sand at his feet. A small shower cascaded about the ant. A small patch struck one of the eyes and stuck there. The ant had managed to work free one of its claws. It used the curved edge to scrape the sand from its eyeball. It made a harsh, rasping sound. Felix shuddered and turned away. Command frequency sputtered. Felix? Asked a voice he recognized as Colonel... What? Schoen? This is Felix, he replied. Felix, this is Schoen. Have you still got that ant? Killing him now, he replied with relief, reaching for his rifle at last. No, don't kill it, cried the colonel. I told you not to. Felix sighed, keyed the safety back on. So you did, Colonel. But I thought that, since you're... Don't, Felix. I'll tell you when. Felix counted to 10. Felix? Yes, Colonel? You didn't kill it, did you? No, Colonel. Still got it, then? Colonel, there's no third way. Yes, of course. All right, Felix. I have you on my hollows now. We'll be there shortly. There was a pause. Felix, I want that ant. I want you to have it, Colonel, he replied flatly, keying off the frequency with a vicious snap of his chin, and turning to... The ant struck him so hard it unhinged his senses. He was unaware of the blazer flying from his grasp, unaware of spinning through the air, unaware of falling. Only when he slammed to the hard floor of the gully behind the dune, some 15 meters below his perch, did he react, in agony. He put a gloved hand to the back of his neck. He had landed there, a concussion that would have killed an unsuited man instantly, and which should have broken his neck, but hadn't. Why am I still alive? He had time to wonder, before the shadow loomed over him, and there was no time for anything but the struggle, and maybe no time even for that, for all was cloudy and indistinct, the ant hazy before him, but moving so quickly, hammering at him, smashing at his chest and faceplate, but
He couldn't seem to move so quickly as he should, as if he were in a thick mist that held him, but freed the ant to rake and pummel him from side to side. My God! My God! And then, suddenly, his eyes snapped into focus upon the coarse fibers of the ant's midsection, swinging before him, and the claws smacking down vice-like onto his upper arms, and the pincers! The pincers! One of the pincers was already into the waist seam, its curved scimitar-sharp edge slipping into the narrow slot and sawing machine-like back and forth within it. The image froze him. The image. This image. Of death. Of death! Damn it! Seconds, moments away. The seam wedged through and splitting in him, Felix Olivim, his thoughts and memories and bones and intestines spewing out the tiny hole, pulsing, crushed, stone-frozen blood jutting. No! No! He shouted in a disgusted, furious refusal. No! And he erupted. He had no purchase, no leverage, no position. The ant had all of those, leaning over and down upon him, claws and pincers wedging and tearing. But he had fear. He had that. Felix erupted with that. He shook and warped back and forth. He vibrated and wrenched up and down and back and forth. None of it enough by itself, but none of it alone. He dragged one leg loose, got a knee up, got an armored boot planted firm. He lifted up off the sand, bringing the ant with him, and slammed back down against it. The concussion tore one of the claws free of its grip. It tore the pincer clutching his waist seam off at the joint. Felix used his free arm to hammer at the ant's skull again and again and again and again and then he was free from it, and backing away, chest heaving. The ant stood erect too, coming at him again. But free now and ready, he stepped inside of the arc of the side-swiping claws and pounded upward into the thorax with 3 rocketing forearms in a row. The ant staggered straight back and fell full length into the sand. All right, Felix thought, stepping forward to drive his boot into the brain case with a single, hurtling, "Felix!" shouted Shoen from the far end of the gully. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He spun around toward her furiously, his chest still heaving. "What the hell does it look like?" he demanded. There were 2 warriors with her as well as someone wearing one of those all-size pea suits. One of the warriors, he noticed, was holding his blaze rifle. "I told you not to kill that ant," she said angrily. He pointed a shaking finger at the creature struggling to rise. "You should have told him," he snapped back. "Felix, I told you I wanted it alive." "He's all yours, Colonel," he replied, stepping aside as it rose to its pads and lumbered toward them. "Huh? Oh, Ling! Kill it!" One of the warriors raised an arm and blazed its head neatly off. It collapsed as if exhausted into a heap. Felix stared, unable to speak. "All right, people, get to work," added Shoen. The others hurried past Felix toward the body. One of the warriors handed him his blazer. "Here you go, Scout," he said pleasantly. Felix nodded dumbly. He snapped the rifle into place on his back. He stared at the 3, busying themselves with the carcass. He stared at Shoen, walking easily toward him. He shook his head as if to clear it. Shoen, looking at him, laughed suddenly, all traces of anger gone. She patted him on the shoulder heavily. "Easy there, Felix," she began. "I know it must seem a little—" He shoved her arm angrily away. She laughed again, turned to the others. "Is it all right? What you need?" The tech wearing the pea suit looked up from her work. "Fine. No damage?" insisted Shoen. The pea suit shrugged. "Nothing important. Missing a pincer." Shoen regarded Felix once more. She seemed to be holding back more laughter with great effort. "What happened to its pincer, Felix?" Felix forced his voice to stay calm and flat. "My guess would be birth defect, Colonel." Shoen laughed again, a pleasant, breathy sound. "I see," she replied, reaching forward and pulling the pincer loose from his waist. And what do you suppose this is?
Felix glanced down.
Lodgepin.
He said. Showen laughed again. She tossed the pincer away.
Got it, Colonel!
Cried the pea-suit, holding something in the air for them to see. Felix stared. The tech held a length of ant spine between her gloved hands. It twisted and turned in her grip like a beheaded serpent.
Great,
replied Showen.
You three hurry up and get that back to the bunker. Have they dropped it yet?
Asked one of the warriors. Ling, the one who had blazed the ant.
They will have by the time you get back.
The colonel looked at Felix again.
You ought to come too, Felix. It should be quite a sight.
Felix only stared at her. She laughed again.
Colonel?
Called the tech.
Aren't you coming? No. You three go ahead. I'll stay here with our scout.
She waved them off.
Felix, you really don't know what's going on here, do you?
No.
You usually sleep during briefings, do you?
Felix took a deep breath.
What briefings are those, Colonel? Don't tell me you haven't been briefed, Felix. Very well. Must have been 10 briefings on this drop. There were 2 on the bunker alone. Imagine that. She looked at him. Felix, they wouldn't have dropped you without a briefing. Of course not. That would be insane.
True.
They never do it. Never.
Now she stared at him.
Are you telling me... But why? Why would they do that?
He shrugged.
Why not?
She wanted more. Under her repeated urging, Felix gave it to her. He told her, without detail, of how he had been both assigned and dropped within 24 hours. No briefing, no explanation, no option. Showen found it incredible. Felix shrugged again. Welcome to Banshee. Showen stared at him.
But Felix, I've never heard of such a... Hold it a second.
She was suddenly cocking her head. For the next few moments she was silent, conversing, no doubt, on a frequency he didn't receive with brass he didn't know. She broke off at last.
Come on, Felix. I've got to get back to the bunker. They've got another snip for us.
Snip?
Spinal section. Come on.
She hesitated. Felix pointed across the dunes.
That way.
Of course, she muttered. They set off for the original transit area, with Felix in the lead. It took longer than it should have, for Showen kept stopping and looking around her. Felix studied her carefully each time she did this, furiously hoping for some sign of purpose, for any sign of any kind that would tell him that she was not what she appeared to be. A tourist. After several stops and much rubbernecking, he gave up. She was Lieutenant Colonel Showen, his boss, and a rookie. She had never been on Banshee before. The realization chilled him. Halfway there, she stopped abruptly, said, "Damn it!" He stopped beside her and waited, not at all sure he wanted to know. She looked at him and shook her head.
Damn it,
she said again.
They've dropped it already.
He took a chance.
Dropped what? The bunker, of course.
Felix sighed. Of course.
You don't know about that either?
No. She stared at him, gloved hands on armored hips.
Felix, what are you doing on this drop? Why are you here?
Therapy, he said, remembering the psychotech.
Come again?
I don't know, Colonel. I really don't.
Tell me about the bunker.
They started walking again, side by side up the long, sloping edge of a dune. When they reached the top, Showen pointed a heavy armored arm and said,
That's the bunker. Quite a sight, isn't it?
Less than a quarter of a kilometer away, on the broad flat beach beside the poison sea where he had first dropped, where before there had been nothing but flat sand and nervous warriors, was a building. Felix stopped dead still when he saw it. It was indeed quite a sight. Felix shook his head. A building. A man-made building. On Banshee. It's huge, he breathed, half to himself. Beside him, Shoen laughed. 10 meters high, 20 meters deep, 20 meters wide. It's got walls 3 meters deep and 3 stories. It could house our mere 250 warriors and scouts. House? What do you mean, house? She laughed again. It's got pressure integrity, Felix. You can go inside that thing and take off your suit and grab a meal and a shower. What do you think? Felix looked at her. He decided to not say what he thought. Instead, he asked, "Why?" Something in the measure of his appalled disgust leaked through to her. She studied him for a moment uncertainly. Then, she told him what he should have been told before, what the drop was all about. "Felix, we're here to count ants." When he said nothing to this, she added quickly, "Of course, there's more to it than that." But there wasn't, he saw after a while. There wasn't. She only thought there was. She and Fleet and the rest of the fools running the war. Surprisingly, he had already had a few clues. They had dropped him along with 3 other scouts and some 30 other warriors that morning at dawn, with instructions to head due east and look for what had come to be called a dorm. Felix had known about dorms. He had known about them for a long time now, ever since they had thought of them as supply dumps for the ants. And when he had, with the others, stepped over the last dune and seen that low, squat structure, sitting innocently in the sand, the full measure of that nightmare, that first nightmare, had come back to him. Of dropping that very first thing in those rows and rows of scurrying, jamming ants and firing blindly in terror at everything and anything until his blazer had overheated and his mind had overamped. When it had all been over, in seconds, he alone had survived. "I am A-Team," he had said to himself. There had been no one else to say it to. And that had been only the beginning. After that had come the Knuckle and Forest and Bolov and other things that dorms, the mere sight or thought of them, always brought back to him. And he had reached for his blaze bombs as always, not wanting to remember or consider or anything else, just wanting to destroy this one as he had destroyed all others he had seen since, to destroy it quickly and move on and nothing else. Just not remember. But the captain that morning had stopped him. "We don't want it blown," he had said to Felix and to everyone else there. "Is that clear? We want it intact." Felix had looked at the captain, as he had looked at Shoen, and asked, "Why?" And now he was finding out. Or at least, he was getting an answer of sorts. To count ants. Specifically, to count the ants in a dorm. Fleet had learned that ants came in 2 packages: hives and dorms. Hives were the main outposts, the main threats, of course. It was from the hives that the ants directed their assaults on the humans, both on Banshee herself and in space. The hives were the main targets, but the dorms were important too. They did, in fact, serve as supply dumps of sorts. Supply dumps of ants. Thousands and thousands of ant eggs or larvae or whatever was used were stored in these dorms throughout Banshee. They operated as support for hives, or rarely, alone. What Fleet wanted to know now was their capacity for support. Their exact capacity. How many ants could be built before the supply would run out? That was the reason for the bunker. "There are no other ant outposts in this area," explained Shoen as they worked their way toward the activity. "Our job is to sit tight and wait for the ants to attack the bunker. Then, we kill them and count them. They'll keep coming. Of course they will. And we'll get that bunch too. And the next, but how long can they keep coming alone? There's nothing around here to help them.
Sooner or later, they are bound to start feeling the pressure, either in numbers or in quality.
Felix nodded, seeing it.
That's why you want samples of the spinal cord. Exactly, Felix. Very good. We know the normal standards. When shoddy works start showing up, we'll have a good idea of how much they can take. So it's not just to count ants. It's to find out how they build them so damn quickly.
They had reached the last of the dunes. They started across the edge of the beach, circling toward the sea to avoid the construction. A huge machine surrounded by a dozen workers wearing bright orange pea suits was being set up along the perimeter.
Watch this,
said Schoen with some satisfaction. Felix obeyed, stopping beside her, ready to accept anything by now. The machine started up with a horrendous roar and a huge cloud of sand. Almost at once, the cloud began to settle. From atop the machine, which was now rolling slowly forward on huge treads, a nozzle had appeared. It was spraying some clear substance into the atmosphere that seemed to cause the dust to coalesce. Soon, the cloud of sand was all but gone.
Siliconite 18,
Schoen explained.
A sand clotter. It keeps the dust out of the air and makes certain the foundation of the bunker is firm enough to hold it.
Felix nodded, barely listening, entranced by the incredible sight before him. From the back of the machine, a wall was appearing. It was like some bizarre magician's trick, an optical illusion. The front of the machine sucked in the sand. The back of it emitted that same sand in the form of a 5-meter-tall, perfectly smooth wall. Schoen chuckled beside him.
Can't have a fort without a wall, can you?
Felix looked at her. She pointed an armored arm.
The wall will go all the way around the fort in a square, protecting all three sides not covered by the sea. We'll have blazer cannons mounted on top with crossfire covering a killing area of 1,000,000 square meters. Something, huh?
But what he was thinking, what he had been thinking all along, through all of her explanations and enthusiasm, was that none of this had really answered his question. None of it really told him why. He shook himself suddenly, angrily. Why should it, damn it? Why this time instead of any other time? What was the matter with him? The why of it made no more difference than the insanity. This was Banshee. He shook himself again. Banshee! Remember it!
Felix, is there something wrong?
He looked at her. No. She wasn't satisfied.
Something on your mind? What do you mean? Is there something about all of this you don't like? If there is, tell me. I really want to hear your opinion. Why?
She turned away from him. She seemed embarrassed.
I saw what you did with that ant.
She turned back to him quickly.
Oh, just the last part of it. You were free before we had a chance to do anything. Really?
He shrugged. I believe you.
Do you really?
He stared at her.
Of course. Good. I'm glad, because, well...
He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to hear any of it. He said something about her being expected inside.
Oh,
she said, rebuffed.
Right.
And the two of them continued on to the bunker in silence.